conservation and community manager. And my role is multifaceted, but I guess the most relevant part is that I manage our conservation partnerships. So looking at who we're going to work with, who we want to support, what wildlife projects we are interested in. And so I form those connections. And I also look at how we can then take those projects and spread the understanding and awareness to our public about those. So I create what we call interpretive materials, which are basically your big signs in the zoos that teach visitors about our animals, our wildlife, and what their threats are and how we can all help. And on top of that, I also create a lot of our education programs for schools that link to our conservation projects and beyond.
Welcome back to the Burundi to Gombe podcast. I am your host, Dr. Paul Harvey, and this is episode 7, Conservation in Action. The voice that we just heard is Liz Gerber, Conservation and Community Manager at Sydney Zoo.
I actually always loved animals, knew that I wanted to work in that space of wildlife, and I didn't know what that would be until when I finished a science degree, felt a little bit unsure with what to do with it. I knew that sitting in a lab wasn't really where I wanted to be. I love being outside, and I started volunteering at Taronga Zoo when I was 18 and started to learn how much zoos did actually do in the wildlife conservation space. That's where I wanted to be. I didn't realize zoos, or at least modern zoos, had such a strong role there. And that is actually what made me realize that talking to the visitors was a real key part of getting that conservation messaging out. And I've always loved talking to kids anyway. And over time, I saw a lot of the keeper talks. I saw the tour groups that go around, the school groups. And I actually realized that that's the space that I want to be in. I love talking about wildlife. I might as well get a degree in that, and then kind of kept pursuing it from there.
In our lives, we are often influenced by our surroundings. And in Liz's case, she was influenced by her mum and her childhood home. Her surroundings sparked a curiosity and interest that was carried into her career.
I guess, though, I would really credit my mum with my interest in wildlife, though. I grew up in a house with animals all the time, but really parents that fostered my love for being outside and collecting bugs and really tolerating that. I used to bring in lizards in jars and bugs, and my mum would find all sorts of things in my room. So she never said that was gross or yuck and get rid of it. She just kind of accepted it. And a big part, though, for me was we always had on our fridge images of bears. And my mum was a big sponsor for different bears from different charities. But at the time when I was younger, a big problem was the dancing bears. And basically, bears were taken from the wild and forced to dance for entertainment. And my mum was sponsoring them to try and rescue them and then obviously pay for their care once they're in a sanctuary. So I kind of always knew that there were issues with wildlife and there were ways we could help because of that kind of being around me all the time with my mum. And I don't even think she would have realized that she was doing that by teaching me in that way. But it was really impactful for me. And so I grew up always knowing that there were these problems in the world with wildlife, and I loved animals so much. I always kind of wanted to be in that space of helping. So that's probably where it really started, and then kind of just followed study in the area of animals, of biology, of science, and then expanded to education.
Research shows that children who are engaged in nature play and have early life exposure to wildlife grow up being more likely to be interested in and pursue activities that involve the natural world, as Liz explains.
What's so critical is whether or not that's fostered from an early age. Because, particularly from a teaching education perspective, if you've got someone that already has a natural interest there and then that is encouraged and fostered, then you end up with someone as an adult who appreciates and respects animals or the environment. But if you're told from an early age, oh, don't touch that, that's a bit gross, or that can hurt you, then that's when you start to instill a fear sometimes in kids, or even just a disdain for the environment, thinking that it's working against people than for you. And it completely changes, your value on the environment.
Formal education is another important avenue for children to become exposed to the natural world and to develop an appreciation of the significance of wildlife and nature throughout their lives. Initiatives like the Jane Goodall Institute in Australia's Rewild Your School provide those opportunities for education to emerge organically, for children to be exposed to the world around them, to show them the beauty of nature, and to help them get excited and enthused about the natural world. It is in the hope that this will spark a lifelong passion for helping the natural world and maybe one day moving into the conservation space themselves.
Being a teacher, I obviously think it's really important. I did take that step to become a teacher because I saw it being a critical part of the wildlife conservation wheel. And so I think that without education, you really can't make big changes. I always think about David Attenborough once made a really great famous quote where he said, "No one will protect what they don't care about, and no one will care about what they've never experienced." And that's something I always think about when I'm teaching around wildlife, because if you just don't know, how can you possibly make a difference? And something that zoos can do is bring those experiences to our visitors and to our students that come along and give them that spark, that moment of connection with an animal. And then hopefully they'll take that with them from there on and try and make those changes that will actually benefit wildlife and then ultimately people.
Sydney Zoo, although only a relatively young zoo, less than a decade old in fact, has a strong focus on conservation programs, both here in Australia and internationally. As we will hear shortly, both Liz and colleague Lou Grossfeldt are involved in the Burundi project, the focus of course being Musée Vivant. Without the support of Sydney Zoo, both Liz and Lou, along with their teams, would not have been able to involve themselves in the project in the way that they have. In fact, they have contributed significantly to the welfare of chimps in Burundi, particularly during the early days when Debbie Cox needed a helping hand.
So this project first came about to me because of Lou Grossfeldt.
My name is Louise Grossfeldt. Most people call me Lou. I'm the Primate and Welfare Manager at Sydney Zoo.
She has worked in the past with Debbie Cox.
Debbie's been one of the most influential people in my career. I was very lucky to work with Debbie when I was a very young 22-year-old zookeeper. And so, my original passion for wildlife and working alongside wildlife, I think I was very much driven or drawn to the large megafauna like rhino, elephant. And then having spent some time with Debbie working alongside chimps, I felt this flick of a switch. Having worked with her for such a long period of time, we're often talking about working collaboratively on chimpanzee projects. Recently, we've chatted about just some other projects that she's been working on, and then this one came up and it was just such an exciting opportunity.
It's a real grassroots project from a perspective of working in a zoo all the way in Australia and wanting to help somewhere so far away like Burundi in the middle of Africa. Often when you work with projects elsewhere, you don't necessarily see where the effort goes, where the money goes, where your support goes. But this project, working so closely with Leonidas at Musée Vivant at 3Cs and with the Jane Goodall Institute Australia, we're actually seeing direct results when we lend financial support, when we give technical support and educational support. We're actually seeing those results. And for me, that's been the most rewarding part. So it is the one that for me at the moment is sticking in my mind because it's what I'm doing right now. I'll get 100% into anything I'm doing. But this is what is definitely for me becoming the most impactful time for my career.
Liz recalls the conditions in Musée Vivant prior to Sydney Zoo entering the picture.
At the time, there were 3 chimpanzees being held at Musée Vivant, but really weren't having the resources to feed them. Visitors were paying to buy a banana and throw them a banana to eat, and that would be their meal for who knows how long. Flora, who was a young chimp there, she was being kept in a 2 meter by 2 meter cage. So just hearing their story really affected me, and we know there's a lot of awful things going along around in the world with wildlife, but for me, I actually was looking at joining a project around chimpanzees at that time. So for me, it was just serendipitous that came to my attention. And we at Sydney Zoo, being a smaller zoo and a newly established zoo, I wasn't sure what kind of impact we could have. This was something that I thought, there's 3 chimpanzees that desperately need help. We can help 3 chimpanzees. We can't help necessarily 500 in the wild right now, but we can help those 3. And that's why we kind of jumped on board straight away, because we could support them in, for us, potentially a small way, but it would have great impact in Burundi.
One of the things that I'm very proud of is the fact that Sydney Zoo really launched itself really fast into supporting this project. And so when Debbie and I initially chatted really early on, we took up that challenge, and Sydney Zoo supported and covered the costs for staffing and food for the chimps in those very early initial stages when it was quite challenging for them to get the support that they needed. From there stemmed that opportunity to collaborate, and that's, I think, where JGI stepped in and also sort of really picked up that project. And I think from there we've seen other people come on board.
For us, it's about securing their welfare and improving their living conditions, and also helping build up Musée Vivant as a location where their local community can learn about the chimpanzees, learn respect for those chimpanzees, and then take those values of respecting wildlife back into their own home life, so that when they do see a wild chimpanzee, they know what to do if they see it, they know how to act, they know how to live in harmony with those, and reduce the fear around chimpanzees. Because a lot of the local community, from my understanding and from working in other projects, there's often a fear around wildlife because of the conflict that can happen if they come into their land, particularly if they're crop raiding and then they're trying to get rid of them from, eating their crops. That can cause conflict, and then, worst case scenario, someone can get hurt. And so what we're trying to do is kind of become a hub of education as well as chimpanzee care, so that both chimps are protected in the wild and people are also kept safe.
Are you feeling inspired to take action after hearing about the challenges faced by chimps and their carers at Musée Vivant? Did you know that you can help? Find out how by visiting the Jane Goodall Institute in Australia's website, janegoodall.org.au. It's time now to take a pause on Burundi, but we'll head back there a little later on. A genetic bottleneck is an event that causes a dramatic decline in the genetic diversity of a population. Many species have seen a genetic bottleneck occur. Cheetahs, for example, are thought to have already gone through 2 genetic bottlenecks in their evolutionary history. A genetic bottleneck has the effect of potentially creating a new species. Due to the loss of genetic material in the gene pool, a species tends to lose genetic diversity, which means that all individuals within that population start to appear the same. However, this also means that there becomes a greater chance of genetic drift or variations in the genes. And therefore, if those genetic differences turn out to be more favourable for those species, they become reproduced and the species evolves. And so in this way, scientists believe we see phases of evolution taking place when a genetic bottleneck is present. A genetic bottleneck in a captive setting, like a zoo, has a potential to generate negative genetic outcomes for a species, with less favourable traits having the ability to cause significant challenges for captive populations. Lou started to tell me about her work in managing the genetics of chimpanzees. We first talked about genetic bottlenecks and the implications that this has on conservation of chimpanzees and other species around the world. Lou explained to me the work that herself and colleagues are doing to ensure that there is sufficient genetic diversity amongst the chimpanzee population to see these populations well into the future.
We're facing these genetic thresholds or bottlenecks where we see these really big figures in the thousands, and then we really get down to the nuts and bolts of it and we realise that we've got these very small isolated pockets. And we need to do better with keeping these populations connected, and that's where we talk about genetic management. And in the wild, it's really easy for animals, well, it was traditionally really easy for animals to move around and share that genetic material, and those wildlife corridors are the key to survival. Otherwise, we are going to see these populations. While in a book or in an article, we see 40,000 animals, we think that's really viable, but the reality can be very different. And I think it's applying those concepts to managing these animals in a human care situations. One of my roles at Sydney Zoo is to oversee the regional population management program for chimpanzees. And I work alongside another individual called Blair who works at Rockhampton Zoo, and together we work with all the regional stakeholders, including overseas organisations, to make sure that we also manage the genetic population of chimps to ensure that if these animals are ever needed to go back, they can.
And ensuring that chimpanzees don't end up experiencing a genetic bottleneck requires a number of stakeholders to work together.
We sort of manage them regionally, but we also have a great deal of international collaboration. So most programs are managed under two concepts, and that's, genetic management and behavioural management. So while it's really important for us to try and maximise and minimise inbreeding, but maximise the use of our genetic material, that must fall within those parameters of normal behaviour of different species. So if we're talking about something like chimps that are a multi-male, multi-female social structure, males don't normally move out of the community that they're born in. Females, when they reach that early sexual maturity, they tend to emigrate from one community to another. So while you're also looking at genetic diversity, you're also making sure that you provide those normal opportunities for chimps to move. It's quite late, it's quite complex. It just requires a great deal of collaboration and cooperation and wildlife organisations working together.
So is there a magic number that ensures that a genetic bottleneck doesn't occur? I wanted to know.
It really depends on so many different factors, and at the end of the day, history tells us that most of the animals that have come into a human care environment, we're never really going to know the history, record keeping, and those initial collection days way back when. I guess a lot of our decisions around breeding today are potentially based on speculation, but I also think now with science where it is that we're able to take really good DNA samples and we're able to get really good science behind the decisions that we've made or that we continue to make. And remember, this really is a collaboration. So, the Australasian region working with the North American region, working with the European region, working with SEASA, which is Southeast Asia. So I feel that those relationships are incredibly important.
Lou had spoken quite a lot about chimpanzees in zoos and other captive settings. As this podcast series is all about joining Burundi and Gombe through a wildlife corridor where chimpanzees can interact and increase genetic diversity in that region, I was interested to know whether or not these same genetic bottleneck influences pose as real and big risk for wild populations as they do for captive populations.
But probably truly wild chimps, obviously not. That the choice to breed, the choice to move, that sits within, the privilege of living in the wild. So, however, it probably doesn't offer you the same level of protection, say, living in a zoo does today. So obviously, for wild chimps, there's so many more scary challenges out there. So sanctuary animals, there's probably a degree of management that I say would sit within the framework of zoo-based management, trying to make sure that you make good decisions if you are breeding chimps in those sorts of situations. So I think it's just that along a spectrum of where, in a human care environment, we do need to get some good science behind that because, they are sitting within our captive facilities. And so we do have a moral responsibility to make sure we're doing the right thing.
After hearing about the process and understanding more of what it is that Lou and her team does in terms of preserving genetics and preventing genetic bottlenecks, I was curious to know whether that level of intervention had any negative outcomes for the species.
Breeding or supporting any endangered species, of course, comes with risk, but I guess so does everything that we do. But I think the greatest risk is doing nothing. And I think, if we do nothing and we lose this incredible species from our planet, I think would be just one of the most heartbreaking things to have ever occurred. Not only the fact that we have so many unique animals on our planet, and that, chimps are incredibly special, but they are our closest living relative. And I think we do have a moral obligation to ensure that, they're here for generations to come.
There is absolutely no doubt that Lou and Liz and the team at Sydney Zoo have a passionate commitment to wildlife and chimpanzee conservation. But back in Burundi, there is still so much more that needs to happen to help the chimps, as Liz explains.
Something that we really need still to keep supporting the welfare of the chimps at Musée Vivant is to build them an outdoor habitat. We have drastically improved their current living conditions and the rooms that they are currently living in, and that's been fantastic. But they still don't have a free roaming outdoor space that's protected. And that's something that is a big goal of ours over the next few years, hopefully before the next few years if we can get enough support. And that would just transform, their ability to move around and socialize and climb and get fresh air and be on grass. And that's what we really want for them.
Once again, we were approaching the end of our time together. As has now become customary in this podcast series, I wanted to know from both Liz and Lou what their hopes are for the future of conservation for chimpanzees and the planet.
I have to believe that we can make a difference. I think the risk of losing any of our wildlife at the moment is very real. It's very real, and I think we can see that in our own backyards. We know that they're in an unfortunate situation, but we continue to make decisions that don't stop that process. So is the risk real? Yeah. But am I going to stop fighting? No.
For the chimps at Musée Vivant, as you know, I would love to see them have that beautiful outdoor facility. For the wild chimps, if we can keep protected what they have left and create that forest connectivity down to Tanzania, that would be amazing. And my hope for chimpanzees across the world actually is that they're no longer in captivity. As much as I love zoos and work in a zoo, I do believe, and I think everyone that works in zoos, we all want to see the animals in the wild. We don't want to see them in the zoo. The zoo is really just an essential part at the moment to ensure that they are still in existence and we still know about them and we care about them and we can run these conservation projects. But what we want is for them to be in the wild. And the dream is one day that there will be no chimps in zoos.
My hope for the future is one of compassion, one of understanding. We will never be able to eat money. We'll never be able to eat the house that we live in, or if we run out of water, we run out of food, we run out of nature. The rest is so irrelevant. And I guess wanting people to realise that stuff doesn't mean anything at the end of the day. How many outfits we buy, how many cars we have, resources that those sorts of what I call often referred to as landfill. A compassion and an understanding that we need to invest in nature to not only ensure the survival of the unique flora and fauna on the planet, but that also includes our own survival. The reality, and I often say this to people, is the planet can only support so many people. And I think at some point in time we need to have that hard conversation about what that looks like. At what point in time do you realise that we just can't simply buy another planet?
This podcast was produced by me, Dr. Paul Harvey. I want to extend a huge thanks to all of the guests and those people that have worked behind the scenes to make this podcast possible. Please share your feedback, questions or comments to paul@docpjharvey.com. You can find more of my work by visiting www.docpjharvey.com.